right. Good evening, everyone. Sorry we're a bit late. My name is Carlos, and I am here back again with Dr. Richard Rubenstein. And before we get to him, let me just show you a little bit about ourselves. If you're not familiar with our ministry, you can go here to focusonthekingdom.org, and there you can find out who we are, founded by Sir Anthony Buzzard. And you can see our social sites there. So we have a Facebook group. That's Anthony's Twitter. We also have YouTube, and this will be uploaded later, recorded in our YouTube channel, and you can contact us as well. And if you want to search any type of topics, issues, or people, you can have a look at our search bar there. So, all right, I'll bring up Dr. Rubenstein. And, let me help. Good evening, Doctor. How are you?
Good evening. I'm fine. How are you?
Good, thank you. Hope you're keeping yourself healthy during this time.
Thank you. I'm trying hard, and so far, so good.
Great. So you are once again in Virginia, is that right?
I'm in D.C. actually, in district in Washington.
Okay.
I teach in Virginia at George Mason, but I live in Washington.
Right. So yes, George Mason, and you can find out more about Dr. Rubenstein here, University Professor of Conflict Resolution and Public Affairs. And there's his little bio, and you can find all about his publications, his various books. But this evening, this is, I believe it's our third chat, Doctor. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Well, thank you for your time. And today we're going to talk once again on this great book that you published some time ago now, about 20 years ago, I believe.
That's right.
2000, When Jesus Became God, the struggle to define Christianity during the last days of Rome. So in this session, I want to talk about really two topics. Emperor Constantine and the effect he obviously had on the Christian movement, Christian faith as a whole. And on the number two topic of Nicene-Arian councils. So, but before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about your current work? Last time we spoke, you told us about a book you're working on the Apostle Paul.
Yes, I am working on a book on Paul now. My teaching and a lot of my writing is in the field of conflict analysis and resolution. And the school I work for is called we changed our name recently, I'm happy to say, and we're now called the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. We are interested in trying to analyze conflicts and develop better methods of resolving them without violence. And Jimmy Carter is a great inspiration to a lot of us, especially because of the work that he did after he was president, when he became one of the world's leading peacemakers. One of the things that has interested me greatly for a long time, and a lot of us, has to do with the role of religion in conflict situations, the role of religion as a factor in causing conflict, but also the role of religion as a factor in peacemaking. And Carter himself was a religiously oriented person who used his religious traditions to try to make peace around the world. It's been very interesting to be teaching about this at a time when conflict seems in some ways to be getting worse. not only in other countries that we'd long identified with as sources of religious conflict, but in our own country. So the question that sort of hangs over a lot of our inquiries, and I think even including the one that we're going to be talking about tonight, is how can we have differences and express differences that are serious differences, not just superficial, without getting ourselves killed and without getting ourselves in a position where we're willing to kill others.
Right.
So,
and what can you tell us, Doctor, about your current? You're working on a book, I believe, on Paul.
yeah. So, I mean, the example of Paul is so interesting, and I think one of the things it tells us is that as soon as we go back into history and we look at controversies like the Arian controversy, which we're going to be talking about in a few minutes, or the many controversies that St. Paul was involved in, is that how we look at those controversies and interpret them depends a great deal on what we're living through now, and what we're sensitive to now. And the Paul situation is really so interesting because Paul lived at a time when the empire of which he was a citizen, the Roman Empire, because as you know, he was not only a Jew, but he was a citizen of the empire, was in serious decline. And the question was, how was that going to happen? Was the empire going to decline slowly or quickly? Was it going to collapse? What did it mean for Romans to be part of an empire that for 700 years had basically ruled the world, and now was maybe that was not going to last? And what would replace it? What might even be a better way of organizing a world order? Since Paul was a Jew, he had immediately an idea about that, and the idea came from Isaiah and Jeremiah and the other prophets, and the idea was that the world would somehow be reorganized in a way that would make it that would make it more God's kingdom than man's kingdom. The world could be reorganized in a way that would be radically different in many ways from what had gone before, but that would be better for everybody if it were transformed. But the process of transformation, the process of moving from a power-based world, a world where basically the Romans told everybody what to do, and had even gone so far as to call their emperor the Son of God. Now the Roman world was going to change, and Paul understood that the emperor was not the Son of God. The Son of God was somebody else. But the vision that he had in mind was a vision of a world of nations living at peace, and developing the potential of human beings to be better human beings under norms that were given through God, by the prophets and by other figures, great religious leaders. So how could this happen? And the fascinating thing really about Paul is that Paul does not appear in history as an apologist for any particular system of power. He appears as the prophet who says that the kind of power that we've been living with and been living under for a long time is disappearing, that the kingdom of God is starting to appear, and it's starting to appear within us, not only externally. But Paul also believed that aside from the kingdom of God being within, it would also be without. That is to say, the world itself was going to change in ways that would make it a more human society, more harmonious with the ideas that had been announced by the prophets as being consistent with what God wanted for us. So he's such an interesting figure to talk about now, because we are living in the end times of the American Empire, in my opinion. American Empire, as empires go, hasn't been a bad one. There have been a lot worse empires than the American Empire, but it's still an empire. It's still a human empire, which is now, I think, giving way to a different kind of world order, which we can only dimly foresee and understand. But our duty as people of God is to try to make that new world order one which conforms with the norms that we have learned to love in the Bible. So Paul seems to me, and he seems to a lot of other people now who have gotten more and more interested in him, as not so much the person who announced not so much the person who defended authority, for example, not so much the person who said that you should obey the authorities, and women should obey their husbands and that sort of thing, but rather the person who saw that all of that was temporary, and that we were really living in the period of the Great Transition to something much different and much better than what we've been living with for a long time. Some Christians call it the Second Coming, and some Christians call it the Second Coming of Christ. But however you want to describe it, it's something new. It's on the way. And I really sometimes think that if people in America, where people are at each other's throats at the moment, on the basis of all kinds of disagreements, if they could only understand that what they really, in some ways, agree on is that this change is on the horizon, and that we want it to be the kind of change that will make us, proud and happy to be human. This is not a bad time. Everybody is talking about what a bad time this is for us, and it's a hard time for us, no doubt. It's not a bad time. It's the eve of something much better than what we've been living with for a long time.
Right. Well, it sounds very interesting, and that's really the topic, the kingdom of God, isn't it? That is coming soon. It's at hand. The Old Testament prophets continually talk about. So let's jump in, Professor, to some of the topics tonight. So we're streaming live, by the way. If anyone has a question, just type it in wherever you are. If you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, and I'll pass it on to Dr. Rubenstein as time permits. So this is your book, and I want to ask you, obviously this book deals, as you called it, the struggle to define Christianity. And it's really about this Council of Nicaea in 325 and the effects that had. And obviously a large chunk of the book is about one emperor called Constantine. Now, my first question is, I hear a lot, that Constantine was the first Christian, quote unquote, emperor. So my question is, Doctor, what is your opinion about Constantine? Was he Christian in terms of how the New Testament defines, to your understanding, Christianity? So what do you make of this emperor?
Well, let's start out by being humble about this. When you look back to a figure like Constantine and you see he's pushing all of our buttons, what he really was like, it's very hard to say, and we have to have a big footnote, an asterisk, which says we don't. It's very hard to interpret somebody like this who lived such a long time ago. That having been said, in some ways you can say it seems to me that he was a serious Christian, in that he understood at the end times of the Roman Empire that something was going to have to change. And he had the intelligence or the sensitivity to realize that a philosophy that was really, if you go back to his period, you understand that Christianity was spreading very rapidly in the Roman Empire. I mean, Christianity was one of the very popular new philosophies in the Roman Empire. But there were others. There was a lot of competition. People in the empire kind of understood that the old time religion, the old paganism, didn't seem to be getting anybody anywhere, and it had gotten to be, or shall I say, rather a kind of cold and formalistic way of expressing one's Romanism. That new currents were coming through the empire. Christianity was not the only one. There were religions that were being promoted, for example, like Mithraism and others, a lot of them from the East. Constantine, I think, understood that. Let me also put this in context for a minute. If you're going to talk about Christianity in the 4th century when Constantine lived in the 300s, then you have to take into account what happened in the 200s. And in the 3rd century of the Roman Empire, not only was the Roman Empire itself in some trouble, there were tremendous economic problems and divisions between rich and poor in the society and all of that. But there were also external threats. The people that the Romans called barbarians, by which they meant anybody who wasn't Roman, were starting to make great gains against the empire. They were being attacked in the East, for example, by the Parthians and other folks. They were being attacked in Europe by the Germanic tribes. And in the 200s AD or CE, the Germanic tribes started to win battles. I mean, they started to make some victories to gain territory in a way that was really terrifying to a lot of Roman citizens. And partly because of that, this had caused a kind of convulsion in Roman politics, which was in a position at that time in which of great instability, in which emperors were being, as you probably know, emperors were being named on the basis of, there were military guys who commanded support among the army. And so you never know who's going to be emperor next. And there was one period, one year in which there were 4 emperors in 1 year. It was a very unstable situation, and a situation in which imperial security was really at risk. So the Roman Empire looked like it was in serious trouble. And within that trouble, the next thing that happened was a couple of emperors came to the fore and promised to protect the empire and restore it. And when they said restore it, they meant not only hold the barbarians back at the borders, but also to kind of remoralize the empire, to make it again a place where people would be happy to live and would solve some of the major internal problems. The first of these major reforming emperors was named Diocletian. And like a lot of the emperors who would kind of turn up now in these late days of the Roman Empire, they weren't necessarily Romans. I mean, they weren't from Italy. They tended to be even from the Balkans, from places conquered by Rome, civilized by Rome, but but that were more in contact with the kind of the external portions of the Roman Empire. Anyway, Diocletian was this powerful figure who reorganized the Roman system of government. And I won't go into details about that, but he did it. He created a situation in which power was delegated to people who were called eventually Augustuses and Caesars in different part of the. Anyway, he's trying to keep the empire going. He did quite a good job, but he also hated Christians. And he decided that the part of the problem was that these newfangled, these Christians had insulted the old gods, and that if you were going to have a revival of the Roman Empire, it would have to be a revival of the old time religion, which now we call paganism, but that's just a term that we use. They called it the worship of the true gods, and lots of gods and goddesses. So Diocletian not only helped defend the Roman Empire against its enemies, changed its political organization, but he also persecuted Christians in a way that had never been done before. It was a vicious persecution. And because of that, it was a tremendous trauma for the emerging Christian community. So when Constantine finally emerged and became in the next century became what we now think of as the first Christian emperor. The first job he had was to try to heal the wounds of persecution that had been created by Diocletian and other anti-Christian Roman officials. And that's one reason why the Council of Nicaea that Constantine convened was so popular, if you like, was attended by people with such, there was so much emotion around it, because here was a Roman emperor who said that he was a Christian, who had replaced some of the most vicious persecutors that any Christians could remember. And there are very moving stories, even of people who came to the Council of Nicaea, priests and bishops, mainly bishops, who came to the Council of Nicaea with their wounds still with their crutches, or still with their, disfigured by wounds that had been administered by the previous Roman emperors who had been persecuting Christians. So that the tremendous credibility that Constantine had as the first Christian emperor, even though how Christian he was is still really a subject of debate.
Right.
He was thought about that way because it was such a relief to have somebody in power who wasn't going to persecute everybody.
Sure. Let me ask you quickly, Professor, on page 44, I want to ask you a bit about this quote. You write that Constantine was one of those advanced pagans who believed in a supreme god, the Sol Invictus, unconquered sun, but he was also interested in Christianity and had acquired a Christian counselor, a Bishop Josias of Cordova, who seems also to have been a close friend. What do you mean here by advanced pagans? So he was one of the advanced pagans, Constantine.
Okay, well, really what I mean is this. I have no idea what he really, what he thought about Sol Invictus. You could believe in, for a long time, if you were going to be a pagan, if you're going to be a polytheist and believe in that there were many gods, you might believe that all the gods were equal. You might believe, or you might believe that there was some gods were more powerful than others, or you might believe that there was a top dog, a supreme god, and that you would still be a pagan. the God that they believed in was not Jehovah. It wasn't the God of the Jews or the Christians. But the great scholar Peter Brown, at Princeton, who talks about the history of this period in such an interesting way, says that pagan society was evolving also. It was turning. There was more and more interest generally, especially among educated people or people who thought about these things. There was more and more interest in the possibility that there was a supreme God. And some of the pagans, even under the heading of philosophies like Neoplatonism, for example, had decided that this God might be invisible, that this God might be all-powerful, that maybe the God would have had something to do with even the creation of the universe. And so these, what you might call subversive ideas within the context of the old paganism, were starting to emerge, not necessarily connected with Judaism or Christianity, but they were creating a terrain that was fertile for the injection, if you like, or for the beginning of. People were more inclined to accept this idea of the invisible, creative, all-powerful God, because that, in a way, pagan society was moving in that direction too. So that's what Brown says, and I think his argument is quite convincing. So, the problem with trying to apply this thing to a guy like Constantine is that Constantine was basically a soldier. He spent practically his whole life in fighting one war or another. He made his reputation. His father was also a soldier, and he made his reputation as being a good fighter, for Rome. And one reason he got the support of the army, which without that you couldn't become emperor in Rome. So how serious he was about theology, I don't have the slightest idea, and I don't think anybody else does either.
Right.
Except in a kind of superstitious way, when he was fighting against Maxentius and Licinius, the other people he had to overthrow and had to defeat to become Roman emperor. When he was fighting against them, two things happened. All right. One is that he is said to have seen a sign, to have seen the sign of a cross, more or less, on the sky, and accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." And after he saw the sign, he had his soldiers put the sign on their shields. It was called the labarum. It was the Cairo. It was a combination of Greek letters that has become associated with Christianity. And so he thought this was a kind of magic anyway that would help him conquer, and it did. There's that. There's something else too that I think the historians are eventually will know more about this. But the Christians had become an important group in Roman society. The number was growing. They were also tended to be opinion makers. They tended to be. There were slaves who were Christians and stuff too. There were lower class people who were Christians, but a lot of the Christians who were the kind of the movers and shakers in the very early phases of the movement were educated. And actually, a lot of them were women also. And anyway, these were people who, if you were going to be a contestant for power in Rome, you wanted these people on your side. Not even because there were so many of them, but because they were smart, they were good organizers, they cared about other people, they had become famous for organizing rescue it. They become famous for organizing relief operations in the face of famine, and in the face of war, in the face of natural disasters. So these, if you were going to be a contender for emperor, for power in Rome, you wanted to have the Christians on your side. And I can't believe that a guy as ambitious and calculating as Constantine wasn't interested in that too.
Right.
So that he would see, he would see if he became a Christian, he would have a base of support in society. It was not going to be a majority, but it was going to be a very active and important minority that would support him.
Right. Let me ask you to move into his influence on the so-called Council of Nicaea. So on page 62, you write that as a Latin-speaking Westerner, Constantine had little patience for Greek theological niceties. So far as he was concerned, the Christ who had appeared to him in a dream led him to victory and given him an empire to govern was God. And then later on page 69, you say that his great hope was to convene a conference that would end the bishops' bitter wrangling and begin an era of harmony in the church. Can you talk about more about the influence Constantine had on the proceedings at Nicaea, if any, or what can you make from the historical records?
Yeah, the best that I can do with that is to say that Constantine, he wanted, first of all, he wanted peace in the empire. He didn't want Christians or anybody else, kind of wrangling with each other and weakening the empire through internal divisions, because the empire was already so divided internally. The internal conflicts were had become tremendously bitter between the city and the country, between North Africa and Europe, between this region and that region. He didn't want any more division. But also, I think it's important to say that that Constantine was not only interested in peace, he was also interested in remoralizing the empire. I mean, the whole reason that he was so interested in Christian. I mean, what he might have been he might have been interested in Christianity because he decided it was true. We don't know. But one reason political reason that we know he was interested in it, was because it would give the empire the kind of ideological glue, the kind of motivation, the kind of patriotism, if you want to put it that way, that was lacking. The empire had gone on so long, it had so many problems, internal and external, that it was perfectly clear that just, to go to the old ceremonies and, sacrifice to Zeus or, to whoever, wasn't doing the trick. That this new philosophy, this new ethic, the Christians had already shown that they were community builders, and that that they could get people to do things to cooperate in ways that were good for the community, which the old guard couldn't do. And so I think he was convinced that Christianity was going to kind of replace the old religion and do for the Romans what, in America, people are worried about the decline of this empire. Some of them say, make America great again. And some of them have other ideas about, what to do about the American empire. But I really think that he thought it was going to be a way to make Rome great again. And so in some ways, he was not conscious of the contradiction of the idea of trying to take an existing empire based on violence and subjugating other people and trying to make it also Christian. I don't think he was really aware of the contradiction of that. He was so carried away by the idea that Christianity could help preserve the empire and give it a kind of raison d'etre that it hadn't happened, that it didn't have before.
Now,
Yeah.
let me ask you this, Professor, regarding, let's see, the debate at Nicaea was between the so-called Nicenes, with Athanasius at the head, I believe, and this Bishop Arius, from where we get the name of the group Arianism, or the belief of Arianism.
Right.
What is your understanding regarding Constantine himself? Did he care at all about the one view of Athanasius that tended towards what became Trinitarianism, or was he more towards what we would call unitary position of Bishop Arius and his followers? Well, what do you think?
I think he was always divided about it. I mean, I think he was divided about it. That is to say, it wasn't, Athanasius wasn't really much of a, at this point, at the point of the Nicaea, Athanasius was around, but he didn't have the prominence that he later gained. The most prominent figure was Hosius, the one you mentioned before. I mean, Hosius of Cordova was, in the list of people who attended the meeting in Nicaea. Hosius is the first name on the list. And Hosius influenced Constantine to believe that that Christianity would do better and be stronger and so forth if Christ were identified as God. Constantine himself, I think, was influenced by that notion, and Hosius has gone down in history as one of the main defenders of the what later became the Trinitarian idea. Constantine, I think, was always more interested in peace among the Christians than he was in promoting that particular idea. So a lot of his actions are inconsistent, and his thoughts are inconsistent afterwards. He ratified, the conclusions of the of the Council of Nicaea, which were that God was of the same essence as Christ. Christ and God were of the same essence. But pretty soon, he was trying to, almost immediately, he was trying to make peace between the Nicenes and the Arians. And the Arians, as you know, were the people who believed that Christ was divine, but not the equal of God, and not a God, but rather the Son of God, and the greatest of all prophets, and so forth. So Constantine sort of varied. He moved back and forth between those positions.
Right. So when he dies, Professor, or just before he dies, this has always baffled me, and I'm sure historians as well. He calls Eusebius, who was not a Nicene person, but an Arian bishop, I believe, to give him, as it were, the last rites and to baptize him.
Yeah.
Before he dies, as you say in the book on page 139, like many other powerful figures, Constantine had not wanted to become fully a Christian while faced with the necessity, as he saw it, to sin. So that's an interesting aspect of the man. So the question is, why does he then call an Arian, a well-known Arian bishop, Eusebius, to give him the last rites and to baptize him? What do you think that was?
Well, in part, I think really there were a couple of answers. One answer is that Eusebius of Nicaea was a politician, like the great bishops of this period. I mean, these were not just church figures. If what you or I think of as a priest or a minister is somebody who turns up on Sunday and preaches a sermon, these guys were powerful. We would call them secular as well as religious officials. They were in charge of all sorts of things, like distributing goods to poor people. Distributing charity was one of their functions. They were constantly in contact with the emperor and with the imperial administrators. Anyway, they were not just. This was not an age which made much of a separation between church and state, as you know, and so they were politicians. So you can say, well, Eusebius was, in some ways, he was sympathetic with the Arians, and he was not going to condemn them. On the other hand, he would kind of go both ways. The other thing, of course, was he was the main church official in the area in the region in which Constantine had become ill, and he had to get the last rites from somebody, and it wasn't just going to be a parish priest. So sometimes I think part of this was because he was ill where he was ill, and Eusebius was there. Also, they were friends. They had relationships in the past, and as I said before, since Constantine was not a particularly doctrinaire person, his main interest really was defending the empire against military enemies. He was not going to make a big issue, I don't think, of whether this was a pro-Arian or an anti-Arian priest. But he didn't. He didn't particularly like people who were too doctrinaire one way or the other, like many of our politicians might be today. So, however, I do think that having the last rites administered by Eusebius really signified the idea that was very powerful in those days, which was that Christians could disagree about theological issues, including important theological issues, without necessarily becoming members of hardened, camps that would have to do away with each other. But the other would have to be declared heretical, and you'd have to eliminate the Arians or eliminate the Athanasians. That was not Constantine's view of Christianity at all. And also, it wasn't the Arian view of Christianity. I mean, the Arians had the view that people could live with these differences and work them out over the course of time.
Except the Nicenes, they wanted the other mob wiped out. I think Athanasius, and
I think so too.
And yeah. Let me ask you about the guy who takes over the empire now. And his name was Constantius, known as the Second. He's the son, obviously, one of the sons of Constantine. Was he an Arian? Was he? It looks to me by the history that we have that he was more leaning towards Arianism, and under his reign, that lasted a while. 337 it says here to 361. This movement that became known as Arianism grew. What can you tell me about, just briefly, about him, Constantius, and the influence he had on Christianity at the time and perhaps until today?
Well, I wish I could tell you more. There are so many figures in history that we don't know very much about because they were declared to be losers, or they were stereotyped. There were lots of other examples of that, but that I won't go into. But it's I'm hoping maybe one of these days somebody's going to do a great biography, find some new material about Constantius and do a great biography of him. We don't know very much about him because he's been labeled the Arian emperor and a bad guy. In fact, as your question points out, he ruled a long time. I mean, he's one of the longer-lived Roman emperors. And he ruled at a time when things could have gotten really bad for the empire, but didn't. He was apparently a good emperor, efficient emperor. All of these guys, of course, I have to say, we're capable of great violence in order to keep themselves in power. For example, killing family members, which Constantius did, but so did Constantine. If they thought that their rule was going to be threatened by claims to the throne by relatives and so forth, they would kill the relatives. And so it's a really there were some nasty habits of Roman emperors, but Constantius seems to have been a fairly reasonable man who did, as you say, lean towards Arianism, but probably towards a viewpoint that historians now call semi-Arianism. Since nothing is stable in the world, especially not in the world of intellectual disputes and ideological disputes, people who were anti-Arians were all disagreeing among themselves about all sorts of things. The Arian movement over time tended to split between people who thought that Christ was a whole lot like God, even if he wasn't God, and tended to kind of emphasize the similarities between Jesus and God, and a kind of later generation of Arians who would attempt to emphasize the dissimilarities. They would not go so far as to say he was just a guy, just another human, but they didn't think that, but they had their own views about what the differences between Jesus and God were. And as you can understand, you could argue about this forever. Well, Constantius was a semi-Arian. He wanted to emphasize the similarities between Jesus and God. He wanted to emphasize, for example, that Jesus was, I'll take an example. If Jesus was not God himself, then Jesus could be tempted to sin. And the New Testament suggests that he was tempted and overcame temptation, that he wasn't simply sinless by nature. So the semi-Arians, would emphasize, however, the fact that that basically he was sinless. Whereas the more radical Arians would say, well, maybe, if he was tempted and we can be tempted, he's more like us. So Constantine tended always to side with the more conservative Arians, the semi-Arians.
Right, now tell me about our second topic here, part 2, if you will. Again, if you have any questions out there, we're streaming this live, Professor, and I see some questions. If you have any more, I'll try and get them in before perhaps the hour's out. I don't want to keep you too long, Professor, but just briefly on the so-called Arian councils. Now, as far as I understand, during the reign of Constantine, there were some so-called Arian councils, that is, people who were against what became the co-equality of the Son with the Father and so on. If you will, the early Trinitarian theology. So there were some under Constantine, but it looks to me like it picked up these councils against Nicaea with Constantius. So can you tell us a little bit about the councils, perhaps around how many councils were there, and in your estimation, and then I'll ask you about the huge, what you call the huge joint council known as Rimini.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, first let's understand that that a council. I mean, it may seem now to be these days it's a very unusual thing for there to be a council. There'll be a, like the Vatican Council, for example, in the Catholic Church. But in those days, a council was the way. I don't know if it was as common as a Zoom meeting, but a council was a way in which, if you were going to get together with other people and talk about what you believed, and talk about policy issues, and even also talk about practical issues, that the council was the way to do it. So people would have councils that were local. Whatever country you were in that would have a church, if it had a few churches, the churches would get together. Their officials would get together every now and then and say, look, we have to work out this problem. And a lot of times, as I said, the problems that they were working out were purely practical. So there were lots of councils. But what was unusual was to have the councils that were called ecumenical. That is councils where people would reach out beyond your own locality and beyond your own region and try to bring in people from a wide variety of regions to try to talk about problems that were thought to be important. So there were many local councils before Constantius. There was one, the Council of Nicaea was an ecumenical council, at least in name, although really almost all of the people who came to Nicaea were from the East, part of the Roman Empire. Under Constantius, however, there were at least 9 important ecumenical councils. And when you look back at those councils and what happened at them, they're absolutely fascinating reading. But also, it's a little. There are exciting things about them and saddening things about them. The councils under Constantius were really attempts, mainly in the direction of what I was talking about before as the conservative Arianism. They were attempts to get people who had been at Nicaea or who thought the Nicene rules weren't that bad, to find some basis on which to agree with people who didn't like the Nicene rules very much, to try to find some consensus that we could all agree that the following issues are important and the following issues are not important. We could all agree, in particular, that Jesus Christ was a uniquely holy person who was in many ways like God, but who was not actually God. That he was still separate from God and in some ways inferior to God. And the people under Constantius, the conservative Arians thought it can't be that difficult to get people to agree that, especially if you think about the times that we're talking about, the Father and Son, that the Father is always superior to the Son. And the Father's the Father. The Father is, all right, and I won't go into it in detail. But the Son, it isn't just any Son, it's the Son of God. So why can't we agree that Jesus is the person in history who we would most want to be like, and Jesus is the person in history who has powers that most people couldn't dream of having, and all of that, but we can do that without saying he is identical with God. Because if we say he's identical with God, we have all kinds of problems. And then we have two gods, and all right. So, and they desperately thought that they could find a kind of reasonable way to get all Christians to agree. And the tragedy was that they couldn't. That people were already so committed to the idea that Jesus and God were identical, that for them was the basis of the creation of a new religion that would definitively separate itself not only from paganism but from Judaism. It just was not going to work. It looked as though it was going to work, and it looked as though it was going to work, especially after Rimini Seleucia, the conference that you mentioned before. I mean, there were these 9 meetings involving a lot of bishops and a lot of priests. Even Hosius of Cordova finally signed on to one of these formulas, saying that Jesus was and God were really similar, although not identical. But in Rimini Seleucia, which was the most ecumenical council ever held, there were close to 600 bishops, 500 and something bishops. They're from both East and West. It was held in 2 different places. Rimini is on the Adriatic coast of Italy, and Seleucia is in Turkey, in modern Turkey. They arrived at a what looks as though it's a perfectly reasonable compromise, and in the wake of it, Saint Jerome in Palestine said the world awoke as if after a drunken party to find itself Arian. It was horrifying to Jerome that the identity of Jesus and God had been questioned. So that's where the split occurred. And I have to say that if you look at these councils as I do from the perspective of conflict resolution, which is what I teach, there's the kind of tragedy of it is that people are looking for a formula. They're kind of looking for words that will somehow resolve a conflict. And the idea is if we can find the right words, we can get everybody to agree to this. But ever since that was the problem with Nicaea to begin with, you would have to try to find out why people disagreed so strongly about what seems in retrospect in some ways to be, to some people is not that important a difference. But although I think actually it is an important difference. But you look and you say, well, why can't they agree on some words? Well, of course, I think the answer is that in some cases words just don't do it. You have to talk about what really divides you. Why do the people who want Jesus to be identical to God, why do they feel so strongly about it? What exactly is the problem? And that's the sort of question that I think we have to ask each other, even in connection with a lot of the conflicts that we're trying to deal with in our own country now. Why does this particular issue play such an important role in your life?
Right. And it's interesting what you say about both groups really trying to find, I think you talk about it in your book, a new theological language, a new sort of vocabulary. And it says a lot about their ideas back then of what became known as the sufficiency of Scripture. So I guess the Scriptures were not sufficient enough. Let me ask you about this council at Rimini, also called Council of Arminium. Arminium. Let me ask you about the creed they come up with, because it's a very interesting so-called creed. It's also known, as you know, as the dated creed. And that's because, as you say in your book, this was the only dated creed. In other words, they dated it specific to May 22nd, 359 AD. And it says in part, since the term essence, ousia in Greek, was adopted by the fathers at Nicaea without proper reflection or naively, and not being known by the people causes offense because the scriptures do not contain it, it has been resolved that it should be removed, and that in future there should be no mention whatever of essence in regard to God, since the divine scriptures nowhere refer to essence when speaking about Father and Son. But we declare that the Son is like the Father in all things, as the Holy Scriptures indeed declare and teach. Now, this is a rather, I would think, Professor, devastating early creed that I don't think many people know about. So, what does this say about Nicaea? And I always hear this, Professor, that these issues of the Trinity and, was Jesus God? Is Jesus just a man, and so on? To this day, I hear a lot of theologians and evangelicals and Catholics and so on say that, look, it's settled matter. It was settled back in 325. But here we have a creed from 359, and it doesn't sound to me like it was quite settled, or even to this day. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, that's such an interesting question. No, it's not. I mean, what the dated creed says is that the way they solved this problem was to kind of go outside of Scripture, go outside of Hebrew, go outside of both Jewish and Christian philosophy at that point, and go and find a term in Greek, homoousios, that could kind of express the identity that they were arguing for, the identity between Jesus and God. And I mean, you have to say, I guess, since the Athanasians, the Nicaeans won that debate, at least, and they got state power to enforce it after Theodosius became emperor. It settled it for a while. It settled it for quite a long time. But one thing about these questions is that they don't stay settled. And I mean, if it's a real question, you can declare whatever you like and say it now it's law. But they don't stay settled, and this question came totally undone again in the modern period of all things. I mean, starting with the 17th century. And as you probably know, Sir Isaac Newton was an Arian. It didn't. It seemed to be settled, but it didn't stay settled just because people said it was settled. It's also it's another illustration of the fact that the right word doesn't settle a dispute like this. That you really have to talk about what what it reminds me of is, again, I hate to keep coming back to our modern conflicts, but we come back to our modern conflicts, and you can have people arguing sort of in the same vein about something like abortion, where some people will say, well, life exists, life begins at conception, and that's the doctrine. That's the doctrinal answer to the question. But if you and I, as thoughtful human beings who don't want life to be ended, not even unborn life, ended unnecessarily or ended, for the wrong reasons. We could talk, if we talk to each other long enough and talk to us as human beings, as humans, and talk to us about what our own views are, and what our own needs are, I think we could come to some agreement, maybe analogous to the kind of agreement that was reached at Rimini Seleucia or at some of these other councils. We could come to some agreement in which we would say to each other, let's not argue about when human life starts as a theological matter. Are we going to argue about the value of human life? Are we going to say that unborn life has no value? No. Are we going to say that it's the only value and that there aren't competing values that have to be talked about and dealt with? No. So how, as reasonable people who care about life, could we resolve this question without coming up with some kind of formulaic doctrinal answer? How could we come up with some answer that would allow us, even though we might disagree, about value priorities, that would help us to preserve life and include in the lives that need to be preserved and cared for the mother and her interests? So when I see people hacking away at each other on the value, and one group saying reproduction is a matter of a woman's choice, period, and another group saying life begins at conception, period, right? I see a repetition of this same kind of conflict that we're talking about today, which it seems to me could be solved if people could talk to each other with more compassion and more identification with what the other person's needs and core values are. That this does not have to be a reason why we're at each other's throats. There are solutions possible. And I think
Right.
ultimately that's why one of the reasons I'm sympathetic to the Arian position in what we're talking about is because I think the Arians understood that a little bit better than their opponents did.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that, Professor, your views there on abortion. Let me get to some viewer questions, if you don't mind. We got some time here. Some questions here. This is sort of a general thing, but people asking about your religious affiliation, if any, your background, and where do you stand in the whole Trinity, non-Trinity debate, if you have any opinions about that.
Well, sure. My religious background is Jewish. I'm not a particularly observant Jew in formal terms. I attend synagogue when I want to, and I'm in dialogue all the time with fellow Jews, but also with the people from other religious traditions. And so when it comes to the Trinitarian versus Arian controversy, I don't really take sides because I think both sides in that controversy are seriously Christian, more so than I am. But I am more sympathetic, I guess, to the Arian side because I think that the Trinitarian doctrine has always been inexplicable, basically. I mean, so it's been a mystery, as its advocates say, which one has to either accept or not, and I don't accept it.
Right. How about this question? If you were faced in front of Jesus today and he asked you, "Who do you say I am?" What would you say?
Well, that's a fair question. That's a fair question, and it's a good question to ask of a Jew. because so much harm has been done to the Jews for such a long time in the name of Christ, that a lot of my co-religionists can't really don't want to talk about him very much or think about him very much, really because of the symbolic association of anti-Semitism and Christianity. But who I think he is the greatest prophet since Isaiah, maybe greater. The people who I personally derive my inspiration from and feel like my values are grounded in are, in particular, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Jesus. And so I don't really deal with or worry too much about the theological aspects of Jesus' existence in my own life, because I'm not really very orthodox. I'm not an orthodox theist anyway.
Right. So he was a prophet, and definitely you would not think he was God in the absolute sense of the word, as the majority of self-professed Christians believe.
Yes, that's right. But I have to say that a prophet is not just anybody. A prophet is somebody you could say sent by God or inspired by God.
Right, the spokesman of God himself.
Right.
Let me ask you this, Doctor. Kingdom of God Ministry and Missions. Do you feel Constantine was really a Christian in the end?
Well, I guess so. Yes, I think so. He could, but it's really hard to say when you're dealing with a person whose behavior is so at odds with what you would consider good Christian, or for that matter, Jewish, or even good Roman behavior. I mean, this is a guy who, had his son and wife killed. There were allegations that his son Crispus and his wife Fausta had that Crispus had either raped her or had an sexual interest in her, or nobody has the slightest idea of whether any of these allegations were true or not. But for reasons we can only guess at, he first had Crispus tried at a secret tribunal in Italy and condemned for something or other, and killed and executed. And then, just kind of to top that, he apparently had his wife Fausta taken into the baths, that were superheated, and pushed into the bath, the superheated bath, and trapped there, and they closed the door on her, and she asphyxiated in the bath. He was real angry at them, and we don't know exactly why. And we do know that his mother, Helena, who was famous, even now is famous in Christian history for having founded the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Israel and in Palestine and done stuff like that, that she was furious, apparently, with Fausta. And anyway, the family relations of these folks were just horrific and violent. And so I guess he, in some ways, I guess he was a Christian in the end. And that, he supported the church. He did all sorts of things to kind of begin the process by which Christian clergy would get tax exemption, and Christian clergy would get all kinds of other privileges, and they would be preferred to Constantine didn't abolish paganism, but he preferred the Christians to the pagans. And he set the stage for later emperors like Theodosius, who would really go after the pagans and shut down their temples and shrines and all of that.
Right, and we think politicians today, Professor, are bad, but these fellows were quite something. But it's interesting to me that at his deathbed, he sort of said what he said about his life, and said, I could not have, in good conscience, he could not feel he could be baptized in Christ.
That's true.
Only until the end, which is an amazing statement that he left for history, because there are many self-professed Christians who don't have any issues with getting baptized and then doing all kinds of awful things.
That's true. That's true.
Let me ask you this, Professor, from Sir Anthony, you know very well, Sir Anthony Buzzard. Will you please affirm that Judaism in its Shema always affirmed a unitary monotheistic God?
Yes. Always. Always. It was, if there's one thing that I remember from my own upbringing as a Jew, that's it. God is one. And that has always had the meaning that it's not just this being who we call God is one, but that there is one who is worthy of worship. There's one before whom you can bow. And that means that when you find yourself bowing before some other authority, you better think twice. This to me was taught me by my father, but also by my grandfather, who always made it clear that when we talk about God, we talk about values towards which we have ultimate loyalty. And you can't have more than one source of those values.
Right. Let's see. How many Unitarians, not Arians and not Niceans, do you believe existed around this time of, let's say, 320 to 381, which is the other Council of Chalcedon?
Well, one answer is none, because as far as I know, there was nobody calling themselves Unitarians. However, I guess if you were more learned than I am, and you were an authority on all of the the church schools of the 4th century, you might find some that sounded more like Unitarians. But as far as I know, there were none. I mean, there was certainly nobody calling themselves Unitarians.
Right. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Professor. Once again, it's always a delight, a pleasure to see you and speak with you. Thank you for taking the time with myself and our audience out here.
Well, let me say, and I don't mean this formally, the pleasure is mine. It always is talking with you, Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yep, go ahead.
Great to hear from Anthony, too.
Yes. He remembers you very fondly from the time you were down here at our conference. Thank you once again. Thank you to our audience. Please get this book. This book will educate you on history. History has a place, and it's very important, especially for the Christian faith. There are a lot of things in this book that you do not know about. I just touched the surface, really. But you do a wonderful job here, Professor. I can appreciate the sort of tedious work that ancient history is, or history in general. But you certainly did a great job here. This book for the ages, as they say. And well, actually, once again, before we wrap up, Professor, can you tell me the answer to the question of the book title. When did Jesus become God?
In 381. in when the Council of Constantinople finally outlawed Arianism.
Right.
At that point, I think that's when the church decided. The church and the emperor decided that Jesus equals God.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay.
And God bless you. Keep safe during this time, and we'll see you down the road. Thank you so much.
You too. Thanks a million, Carl. Take care.
God bless.
Bye-bye.